what should have been just a happy game of football at a youth club in Willesden turned into a night that a number of families would never forget.
They thought they were safe, they thought the family was safe. And yet while living here, their 15-year-old son Kayser was brutally murdered.
Once we finished the interviews and this young chap is charged with murder, he could barely see over the counter. And that's quite a difficult thing to see.
The whole experience was very, very difficult for us, myself and my brother, coming together, working hand in hand with kids of the same age.
The people involved in this case were, in effect, children.
It was a crime of almost breathtaking callousness. Audio was too graphic to be
broadcast. Burning to mask smell of body and liquor.
The life sentence may provide some
men were
closure
killed when the inferno swept through the building that housed
young women unable to defend themselves. The man who tried to kill her will never be free to harm again.
Colin Sutton was a detective chief inspector and senior investigating officer in the Metropolitan Police. He led the investigations into some of the most complex and high-profile cases ever, bringing dangerous criminals to justice.
He showed his
then heard
cowardliness.
screaming. The night store points out the gun. Attack another 146 victims.
In this series, he will take you inside complex cases and show you how the detectives caught the criminals. This is The Real Manhunter.
Now been found guilty on all 29 rape charges. This victim, 89.
The officer in charge described it as a
The
senseless
life
tragedy.
sentence may provide some closure for his victims' families.
I'm Mark Leach, Detective Constable on the Major Investigation Team in 2002.
My name's Dave Leach. Was a detective sergeant in the Metropolitan Police. Served for just a fraction under 35 years with a short spell away in New Zealand. Retired last year in June. In 2002, I was based at Barnes, and Mark had got himself a job on the murder team in general, but not our team. He was based at Belgravia.
This particular case, the case of Kayser Osman, which was March 2002, was the first case that brought, if you like, myself and my brother to the same team, working on the same case. At the time, he was working on a major investigation team based at Barnes, and I was on the same type of thing, but based at Belgravia. We were working under different SIOs, different bosses. But as was usual in those days, what would happen is when an investigation broke or a murder broke, a team would be on call, they'd get called out, and depending on the circumstances, they might need some assistance from another major investigation team, and that would usually be things like house-to-house inquiries and door knocking and CCTV trawls and that kind of investigation help.
For myself and my brother, that was an exciting proposition to be working probably at the top of our profession together on the same murder team. And that's exactly what happened. And, we stayed together for a good few years working on the murder team together. It was fantastic.
In the 2000s, the Church End estate was pretty much like lots of estates in London. There was significant poverty. There were, gangs operated there, and the young people were involved in criminality to various degrees. But there were also an awful lot of decent people who were members of gangs and who were trying to live the best life they could on a social housing estate. It wasn't a notorious estate in that sense, but it had its problems and it had its issues like many estates.
There was a lot of crime on the estate. We were getting frequent calls there. The police were always down on that estate, and there was several murders back in the early 2000s. And I recall going there on at least a couple of occasions to deal with a homicide.
When you have these estates and you have the influence of criminal gangs, of young people, generally involved in kind of low-level crime, low-level acquisitive crime and some drug crime and violence, it puts a pressure on the relationship between the community on that estate and the police, because it's a double-edged sword, really. The gangs and the youth seem to think that the police are overreacting and being heavy-handed and oppressive, whereas the older law-abiding people on the estate tend to think that the police aren't doing enough to make them safe and to clean their estate up. So it's a very difficult position. You get pulled both ways in trying to police these estates.
If I look at where Dave and I grew up, we grew up in East London estate. We were all working people. My parents, everybody around us, all of our people went to work. But we had good, stable upbringings. And some of these young people don't have that. But as I say, there are good people living in these places, and it's a tough place to live.
Kayser Osman was a 15-year-old lad. His family were Somalian, and they'd come to this country as refugees during the Somalian Civil War, as many did.
The Osman family arrived from Mogadishu in 1989 when Kayser was around 2 years old. He was a popular boy. He was expected to do well at school. He loved playing football. He was friendly. He was your typical teenager, into a variety of things, and the apple of his mother's eye.
They came over to this country where they had relatives and ended up living on the Church End estate in Harleston in West London.
I recall him being a quiet lad, got no problem to the police or to the authorities. Just grew up on the estate, nice lad, good family. My recollection of what happened that day was that, you know, as usual, we were based in Barnes in southwest London, and we would have been in the office. I remember the call coming through that there'd been a murder. A young lad had been stabbed, and we were asked to go straight there. So we left base, as many of us that we could get together, and drove down to the Church End estate. The DCI, the SIO in charge of the case was a guy called Alan Albalack, and he hadn't been with us that long. And he wasn't in the office, but he would have got a phone call. And those of us who went down there, there was a briefing held at the nearby police station. There was a briefing held where we were brought up to with what happened by the local officers. And then we decided, or the boss decided, that we would do immediate, which is normal in these cases, we would do house-to-house inquiries, which are, you know, extremely important at the time, and did actually throw up some urgent sort of actions that we could go and deal with straight away.
On an estate like that, you wouldn't ordinarily expect to get a great deal of response. People want to close their doors, they don't really want to get involved with the police. But very interestingly here, many people did talk to us and told us what they saw, told us little things about the estate, what was going on, how people were, you know, young people were, you know, up to different things all the time. It's quite important that the fact that there were no gangs involved. It wasn't gang versus gang. That kind of violence where one group of people or gang visit another group of people or another gang on their turf and create violence and create issues is very different, because that does generate fear. It generates fear in the people that are on the receiving end of that gang, and of the people who live in that area.
When these murders happen, all too often with gang affiliations present in the case, then that means there becomes this sort of omerta, there becomes this sort of wall of silence that's sometimes very, very difficult to break down and difficult to get assistance and to find witnesses. It wasn't the case here. I think this was the case which shocked the estate, and because of that, there was the will there to assist police however they could.
Once word started going out on the estate, there was phone calls coming into the police, and there was an appeal made via the news and the radio and stuff like that. And I think once the actual circumstances of the murder actually reached the public on the estate, we started to get some interest and started to get some names.
Police were completing their forensic investigation and appealing for witnesses. The 15-year-old schoolboy was attacked, detectives believe, after an argument involving a group of up to 9 youths. He may have known his attackers.
We are looking for a group of young men, possibly youths, who are known to be in an altercation with our victim in the Taylor's Lane area.
The identification of these particular suspects came from families who were getting information from their own children. So the names that we got was coming forward from kids to parents, and then parents who were brave enough or upset enough to help us.
I know that it's dangerous, you know, I know that you need to keep to yourself and just be very careful.
I have kids around there as well, and that's not good for them. That's not really good. It's really bad.
The vast majority of residents on that estate were really, really supportive of the police, and we did obtain some really important statements. In fact, eyewitness statements that from people who actually overlooked the scene of the incident, and those people became significant witnesses and gave us statements at the time.
Crucially, we had a witness who was high up looking down on the incident as it happened, and it turns out that Kayser was a bigger lad than the 14-year-old suspect, and there was a game of football, and typically what happens is there's a bit of a tackle or an argument over something that happened on the football pitch, and the 14-year-old Jamaican kid decided to take on Kayser, who was bigger, and that didn't end well for the 14-year-old. And of course there was an element of, you know, he was quite big on his reputation on the estate, and I think that he felt humiliated, so he then shouted to the 11-year-old cousin something like, "Go and get me a knife," or I think he said, "Go and get me the biggest knife you can find and bring it back to me." And that's exactly what he did. So he had to climb through, get into his own flat to get the knife. And all this took about 10 minutes before he got there, got back. Kayser was still present. He gave the knife to the 14-year-old, who did no more than literally plunged the knife into Kayser's chest. And unfortunately, straight through the heart, and he died virtually there and then.
So Kayser Osman was chased by the assailants from the football pitch, and it's at this spot here that he was stabbed, collapsed and died.
Quite early on it became apparent that who the people we were looking for were, the people involved in this case were, in effect, children.
The Osman family came to the UK from Somalia because they were fleeing a brutal and bloody civil war. They came to London and they came to live here in Bruce Road in Harlesden. It's a leafy suburban street, it's quite quiet. They thought they were safe, they thought the family was safe. And yet while living here, their 15-year-old son Kayser was brutally murdered.
I did go to the home address with a family liaison officer, and she was dealing with the family, and they were obviously very upset, but equally a very humble, quiet, nice family, very hospitable, and it just struck me as a very ordinary, just a genuinely nice family, which, you know, as it turned out, was exactly the right kind of, the impression I got was exactly right with that family. The boy, Kayser, the son, he wasn't that sort of lad to get involved in any of this type of stuff.
They were obviously, and this is the point, really. One of the things we do on major investigation on murder teams is behind every job we're doing, every case we're working on, is a family tragedy, and this was it.
We literally turned up as homicide stroke murder detectives, and we just got out there in suits, as I'm dressed today, on the estate, communicating with members of the public, selling ourselves, talking about the facts of the case, not worrying so much about health and safety, just getting on with the job. And as a result of that, within hours, we had the suspects in custody.
Kayser Osman's murder had its origins really in a game of street football, which is so sad. You know, you've got young people on the estate trying to pass the time, as young people, children have done for years and years, and playing football.
Unfortunately, what should have been just a happy game of football, it was a youth club in Willesden, turned into a night that a number of families would never forget. It started off just with a group of teenagers kicking the ball around, having fun. It ended in Kayser's brutal death.
In relation to the suspects, the older one, who was 14, he was a little bit notorious on the estate as being a bit of a bully, and effectively, despite his age, he was not scared of anybody, and his name came forward quite quick. We couldn't locate him initially, but we did locate his cousin, who was an 11-year-old.
The 14-year-old disappears, the 11-year-old goes back home, and obviously the police are called, and there's as much medical attention is given to Kayser as possible, but he couldn't be saved. The investigation quite quickly works out who's responsible certainly with regards to the 11-year-old. The family wrapped around these two boys aren't quite sure what to do, is the truth of it. What happens is that there's implied pressure from us, the police, to get these two young boys to give themselves up. The family of the 11-year-old who lived on the estate initially weren't answering the door, weren't cooperating, but that was really about working out their situation, I think. That wasn't it was avoiding the situation until they understood and got some legal advice and saw, and for their child, effectively. And once they sought legal advice, they brought their young 11-year-old in for questioning. And I think the following day, 14-year-old arrives with his solicitor at Hammersmith Police Station.
So here you have two suspects, one 14 years old, the other 11 years old. Although the 11-year-old didn't do any of the stabbing, he was absolutely instrumental in what went on by going in, breaking in, and getting the weapon for the 14-year-old to use. So there's no doubt that this is the sort of murder that the joint enterprise rule was designed for, if you like, because he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows what's going on and what's going to happen when he takes this knife. 14, 11, they're children. It makes a huge difference for the officers that are dealing with it, because you have to interview them in a different way. You have to be mindful of the fact that they're not mature adults. They've not got the life experience. You need to make sure, for that reason, that they're safeguarded, that they're properly represented and they're properly advised by an appropriate adult with them. It's fortunate that in this case you had Mark Leach and Dave Leach who were available to do these interviews, because the pair of them, were supremely skilled interviewers, and in fact, always at the top of the list for me with any difficult cases that we had or difficult interviews to be done. They're the people I would turn to do it.
It's very difficult, I think, for the police to interview minors generally. They have to have an appropriate adult, they have to have regular breaks, and there can be all sorts of reasons why questioning has to be stopped. The police have to try and look as if they're trying to show empathy in a way, to try and get onto their level so it's not as intimidating. So they'll remove their jackets, they'll remove their ties. There's all these things to take into account, and they have to have a gentle way of questioning, really.
The whole experience was very, very difficult for us, myself and my brother, coming together, working hand in hand with kids of the same age. And we had plenty of discussions about how we were going to deal with it.
My brother Dave deals with the 11-year-old, goes to Collingdale with some colleagues, and myself and other members of the team interview the 14-year-old at Hammersmith. What's very clear to me and my colleagues at Hammersmith is that this is a young person caught in a situation of his own making. I mean, he made the decision to use that violence, but you can tell the fact that they are children, really. And he's now sitting in a cell at Hammersmith Police Station, and there are things in place which aren't in place for adults, like his cell door is open. He's not kind of locked in like an adult would be. So there are situations in place to kind of understand his age. I remember he had his giving him a great big bag of sweets and chocolate and things like that. And this is a young boy who was eating sweets and sitting in a cell, arrested for murder. It's like a kind of difficult to compute at times. But when we interviewed him, and you talked to him about where he went, what did you do, what's the circumstances, this is quite a sullen young man but you can see he's thinking, in his head, he's thinking, this is a bigger guy than me, and that's what you do. He said that Kayser was bullying him, Kayser was bigger, and the only way he could get back at him was to strike back with as quickly and as sharply as he could. He said he attacked him because it was the only way he could save face and stop the bullying. Now, there's no evidence of Kayser bullying him. It was a fallout in a playground, and Kayser was bigger than this young man.
He was just very surly and just took it all in his stride. He gave an account which didn't stack up with witness accounts, so in other words, he was telling lies. You know, legally, as I say, we knew we felt we were dealing with a murder, a difficult murder because they were youngsters, but in the eyes of the law, still a murder. So it had to be dealt with properly.
Now, during the interviews, it's clear that the way we were trying to show this young man maps and direction of travel and where he went afterwards and what he did with the knife and all these kind of things, he couldn't read, he couldn't understand the direction on a map. He was effectively illiterate. And all these things play out when you realise somebody's upbringing and how they come to be where they are, which is sitting in an interview room in a police station in West London. We just want to know what happened. It's all about trying to get to the facts as to what happened. And I was having a conversation with him about the bag of sweets he had and things like that, and what he wanted to do when he grew up and that kind of thing, and the type of sweets he had. And I remember saying to him about a sort of chocolate mint bar he had, and I said that, you know, you can have all the rest, but please save that for me, because that's my favourite. And at the end of the whole process, after he'd been charged with murder and all that, he picks up that, it was the only thing left in his bag, and he picked it up and offered it to me. I obviously didn't take it. Point is that there's a young man who has got something about him. He's not a lost cause. It's just about guidance, understanding what's gone on there. But he has killed someone. You have to remember that, and it's kind of a really difficult thing to do.
A week since Kayser Osman was found stabbed to death, police investigating the incident charged an 11-year-old boy with his murder. 15-year-old Kayser, who arrived in Britain in 1989 when his family escaped the civil war in Somalia, was killed at around tea time last Tuesday.
It's not just about cracking the case, it's not just about getting the evidence that you need, it's making sure that that's done in a proper and ethical way, which is fair to these children that you're interviewing. When we had what was obviously going to be a really big case, that involving Levi Belfield, it was to Dave Leitch that I turned to do the interviewing, because I knew not only that he would do a thorough and professional job, but he had this ability to create a rapport and create an atmosphere within the interview which was conducive to the best evidence being obtained from it.
The first thing you encounter is the booking in procedure and what you're going to do with an 11-year-old. You don't really want to put him in an adult cell and lock the door behind him. You know, as much of the police were vilified, or have always been vilified for, you know, particularly by people on the Alston estate, the last thing we wanted to do was upset an 11-year-old. We had a job to do, but we had this problem within the police kind of station itself where it wasn't set up. Literally wasn't set up with what to do with an 11-year-old. Now, I would describe him as like a rabbit in the headlights, really. He literally, his eyes wide open, he didn't know what was going on. So you literally treat him with kid gloves, and you talk to a level with him where you come down to his level so that you can make him understand what's going on. The biggest problem we had was his legal representation, which was the solicitor that represented him. And the reason for that is that quite often, and I can't recall, to be honest, whether he was a legal representative or a qualified solicitor. And the problem, in my humble opinion, was that if you had a legal representative who weren't really fully trained solicitors, they didn't always understand the implications of telling someone, let alone an 11-year-old, to make no comment. But again, within that community, if a legal representative or a solicitor says to the aunt, listen, when you get in there, make sure he doesn't say anything to the police, then that's exactly what they're going to do. And that, you know, that doesn't help us. Because on the flip side of this is this poor boy's family who are trying to get the truth of what happened, which we kind of knew. We knew, roughly speaking, witnesses are starting to come forward. But you would expect an 11-year-old and his legal representative just to tell the truth. But we didn't really get the truth. We didn't really get much at all, if I'm honest.
I know from talking to my brother, when, you know, once we finished the interviews and this young chap is charged with murder, he could barely see over the counter. And that's quite difficult thing to see, because you can't imagine charging an 11-year-old with murder. But very technically, that's what it was. It was someone bringing the murder weapon to the other offender who commits the offence. That's technically it. Whether you could ever prove the mens rea or the mental capacity to know what's going to happen next is a different situation.
And I wasn't sure at the time whether he actually fully understood what actually happened. I do believe that he knew why he was going to get the knife. Do I believe he knew that his cousin was going to stab the other boy? He knew that he wasn't going to go and just get the knife to just kind of threaten this other boy. So I do believe he knew what he thought was going to happen. But I think when it actually happened, there is a strong argument that suggests that he went into shock and then couldn't quite believe what he saw. So, you know, that's the hardest thing. And of course the law being the law dictates that there's an offence committed, whether he's 11 or not. He's over the age of criminal responsibility, so we didn't have to prove that he knew what was going on. You kind of do have to prove that because he's only 11, but he is over and above the age of criminal responsibility. So did he know what was going to happen? I think he knew something bad was going to happen, but he didn't quite foresee how bad. Well, I charged the 11-year-old, I recall, and he was just standing he was as high as the desk. The desk quite high in the charge room. So at eye level, he was just about able to see over and up at the sergeant who read out the charges. And I recall like tears in his eyes and tears rolling down his cheeks. Not necessarily because he understood word for word what was being said, although it was spelled out to him. But he got the gravity of the situation. He's faced with all this authority. The word murder's used. On this day, you did, effectively as part and parcel of the offence, stabbed to death. Kayser Osman, etc., etc. Now, he understood that bit. And he was clearly upset, which it was upsetting for all of us, to be fair.
Although it's shocking to have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old arrested and investigated for committing a murder, it's a sad fact of life that children are arrested all the time. You know, and a great percentage of all people arrested will be those under 18 for various reasons. So, you know, it's not something that's new or that is surprising for the officers or the facilities they've got, and they can cope with it and they deal with it. The trial went inevitably to the Old Bailey, and the 11-year-old on trial was the youngest person ever to stand trial at the Old Bailey charged with murder. And really, you've got these two quite slightly built young people, and you've got the might and majesty of the most famous criminal court in the land, and the powers of the state raged against them. It almost seems like an unequal fight. The prosecution was led by Brian Altman, who went on to become an eminent QC and indeed was the prosecutor for the Levi Belfield trials.
I remember when we were going to the trial at the Old Bailey, the SIO at the time sort of stepped back and said to Dave and I, well, you're the people with all the information, Dave and I, you know, maybe we should sit and talk to the media, which is what Dave and I did, which was our first experience of talking to mainstream media. And that was a bit of a shock to the system, I have to say. There were two really good witnesses, one who saw the initial fracas in the playground, who lived on a nearby estate in Harlesden. Great witness, was commended by the judge, coming forward and giving evidence, and a witness who lived in one of the flats, which overlooked the actual grass area where the incident occurred. Those two witnesses were really important because it showed the community telling the court really what had gone on. I mean, it's frankly heartbreaking that a young 15-year-old loses their life in such a way. Totally unnecessary. And these two people, the witness who saw the incident at the playground, he lived on a nearby estate, and on the day of the trial, or the day he was due to give evidence, I went to collect him, and we planned to meet at the local tube station, and he didn't arrive. So I had to go and knock on his door. So I walked through the estate, knocked on his front door thinking he wouldn't answer, but he did. I spoke to him and his girlfriend. Good people, living in a really difficult position. He said he was being called a grass. People had worked out he was giving evidence, and I explained this is not grassing about street drugs and theft and things like that. This is a murder of his 15-year-old, and we need him. We need him to give his part of the story, to give his part of the evidence, to see what happened in that playground. And he, sure enough, he did eventually agreed, and I took him out of the flat and we jumped in a taxi and got ourselves up to the Old Bailey, where he gave evidence and was commended by the judge. And that makes the difference. That little piece of real evidence, real live evidence from the community.
Well, the trial played out in a way which most trials do play out. A lot of legal argument. The first thing you do if you're a defence solicitor or barrister is that you try to present situations where the police did wrong. Now, I can't remember word for word, but there was certainly a play on, how the police dealt with these, inverted commas, poor lads who found themselves in this situation. But I can tell you honestly now, even now, I can recall that we did everything we could, given the circumstances. You have to understand, of course, that as much as these lads were young, Kayser Osman was only 15 years of age and had lost his life. Our job was to present the facts to the court, not to point fingers and dictate whether it was a murder, manslaughter, or whatever it was. But it wasn't a pleasant experience going to court and listening to it all play out, to be honest. The children themselves were presented at the Old Bailey wearing suits and ties and well, obviously, the defence brief barristers were going to say to him that you've got to turn up smart. And they were presented that way. The 11-year-old presented as he was when I knew him in custody, really. He was completely clueless as to what was going on, to be honest. As an 11-year-old looking around, you just see this vast old court full of authority and judges and talking in a language that you really don't understand. He was completely lost. This little tiny skinny kid in his suit. You had to feel sorry for him, to be fair. Everyone felt sorry for him, but the 14-year-old was completely different. He didn't really, he was unchanged, he was unmoved, and he just sat there and he had an attitude.
He'd been asked to leave a local school, he'd run away from a children's home and foster parents. His life seemed to be spiralling out of control. We'll never know the ins and outs of these kind of cases and the motivator, but what might be an ordinary game of football to your average teenage boy of 14, to this teenager, it was obviously a lot more important. Maybe it was the highlight of that year, who knows? We don't know the reason behind it, but ultimately what should have been a happy game of football between teenagers proved to be the end of a young life.
So normally it's murder, but because the judge offered manslaughter as an option, you might think that this person has committed the offence but hasn't necessarily intended to kill, or given their age would understand what what they were doing would kill. We understood that this was a tricky situation. Very, very technically, it's murder for both, but you can understand why when you put the layers in about how their age and the complexities of understanding what's going to happen and what murder is, and the intent and the mens rea you need, you realise that manslaughter for a 14, 15-year-old is probably right.
He felt that he didn't want to be constrained by a murder verdict into having to give a life sentence to these boys. He obviously thought that with the freedom that a manslaughter verdict would bring, he could direct a course of punishment for them, a course of a short-term imprisonment, which might lead to their rehabilitation.
And in my experience, juries will take that option if they can, especially for young people. And that's what they did.
And in the event, the 11-year-old was found not guilty, and the older boy who did the stabbing was found guilty of manslaughter and received a sentence of 5 years imprisonment. Now, it's really understandable, given the the young age of the perpetrators, it's really understandable for the judge and for the system, if you like, to try to do their best to divert them to a useful life. They're very, very young. And I think, lots of people say they shouldn't be consigned and written off. But in doing that, you also have to remember that there's a victim's family who have actually lost a 15-year-old son. And it's very difficult for them to reconcile this clemency, this hope that these boys could go on to lead a useful life with the fact that their 15-year-old son has been taken from them.
At the time, I remember feeling a little bit deflated because for us, there was, as I've tried to explain, there's a gap. There's a gap in one incident to the other. There's time to cool down, etc. But we're talking about children and young people, and the context and the mens rea and the thought processes are all a little bit different, and the anger level, etc. So I understand. We understood, but it was tricky because we've got the family to manage, and the family were distraught.
The family weren't happy with the verdict at the time because it's an out-and-out murder.
For the parents of Kayser Osman, today has brought some sense of justice. A 15-year-old boy has been convicted of their son's manslaughter. Visibly upset, they gave a statement through their solicitor.
We are happy with the court verdict in that it attributes some responsibility for the merciless and brutal killing of our son. But we are concerned that a verdict of only manslaughter may not reflect the seriousness of what happened.
Given what happened, given that this was a cold, calculated act, it's actually stretching a point to say that it's a manslaughter. There is no doubt that both these young boys went back there knowing exactly what they planned and what was going to happen.
The court heard the teenager had boasted that he was going to get the biggest knife he could find and write Kayser's face off.
Go and get me a knife, the biggest one you can find, and then plunge it into his heart 10 minutes after the incident shows premeditation, not instant arming as we used to call it. At least he hasn't even got the knife on him. That he's reacted angrily and not knowing what he's doing. He knew exactly what he's doing and plunged it through his heart. So it's a murder. And again, the age and the situation played a part in the manslaughter.
They were absolutely heartbroken. Losing a son must be horrendous. And I can't imagine what pain they've gone through. For them, it's difficult to understand when someone gets 5 years instead of 15, 25 years. It doesn't make sense to them. But you have to balance that with the circumstances of the offenders. So it's a really difficult crime, a really difficult case to get right.
One of the good outcomes of this case, from my point of view, was that Dave Leach was already on the team at Barnes, the team I was to take over. His brother Mark was actually on a different murder team at the time in Belgravia, but the Barnes team needed some help. Mark came across, enjoyed working over there, enjoyed working with his brother. This is the first time he'd worked on a murder case with his brother. And he stayed and managed to get across there. And of course, the Leach brothers became a mainstay of my murder team for the ensuing 3 or 4 years.
Well, looking back now, it was the first case that my brother and I worked together on, which was interesting in itself, and we both did interviews. We were both involved heavily in the investigation. It was unique in the circumstances of the age of the offenders, and it was good. I mean, it was a good job. We got there pretty quickly, and it was a good job.
The real question with this case is to consider to what degree we think the judge was right in steering the case towards a more lenient outcome for this offender.
Looking back, it was the right result. The issue was 5 years enough, I think. The sentence, I think the 5-year sentence and the manslaughter conviction was as much about giving that young man a chance. Because if he gets 10 years and he enters the sort of prison system as a child and comes out in the adult system, I'm pretty sure that the authorities felt he'd be broken completely. and I think they were hoping there'd be half a chance of turning his life around.
We'll never know if this was a pivotal moment, if he used this as a way of changing his life for the better, or whether actually he went on a different path.
What we don't know, what we can't know, because we don't know who he was, is what happened to that young man's life afterwards. It would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see if he took this opportunity he was given and went on not to reoffend and to have a useful life, or whether it was 5 years he was out again and he went back to doing similar things.
It was some people in a canal boat, a houseboat. They were going along the Grand Union Canal at Little Venice, and their boat bumped into something. The police fished out the suitcase and inside found the body of a woman.
She had sort of dreams of coming here, having a better life, getting a job, finding a partner, having children.
Post-mortem suggests it's feasible that when it's put in the suitcase, she was still alive.
It's sort of one of the most sadistic things I think I've ever heard of.
It was a crime of almost breathtaking cowardice. The audio was too graphic to be
Justice burning to master's fellow body in a bedroom.
The life sentence may provide
9
some
men were
closure
killed when the inferno swept through the building that housed
young women unable to defend themselves. The man who tried to kill her will never be free to harm again.
Colin Sutton was a Detective Chief Inspector and Senior Investigating Officer in the Metropolitan Police. He led the investigations into some of the most complex and high-profile cases ever, bringing dangerous criminals to justice.
He showed his cowardliness.
Then heard screaming. The Night Stalker went out to attack another 146 victims.
In this series, he will take you inside complex cases and show you how the detectives caught the criminals. This is The Real Manhunter.
Now been found guilty on all 29 rape charges. Oldest victim, 89.
The officer in charge described it as a senseless
The life
tragedy.
sentence may provide some closure for his victims' families.
I'm Mark Leach. I was Detective Sergeant in the Homicide Serious Crime Command based at Putney in 2015. The investigation into the murder of Marta Ligman was run out of the Serious Crime Office based at Putney. At the time, Putney was a base for the teams, for the murder teams, as we called them then, and the way the case would have come in would have been via in-frame team, a team that are sitting effectively poised to take whatever came in next. And at that time, it was the team based at Putney. So Harlesden, as an area per se, is popular with people who may migrate to this country. It's an area with significant social housing. It has a fair bit of what you might call affordable rental housing, a rental accommodation, which is popular with people who just arrive in the country or are relatively new to the country. Harlesden is an area that's kind of got complex needs almost. You're never quite sure what could go on. It's a complex area with a diverse community.
Marta Ligman was born and grew up in a small village in northern Poland, more than 200 miles from Warsaw. She felt that she needed or wanted to get out and have a life beyond this sort of small agricultural rural village. and decided to come to the UK. She had sort of dreams of coming here, having a better life, getting a job, finding a partner, having children, generally just looking forward to life and making her way in the world. And she was quite a gregarious, outgoing person. She was quite striking. She was quite small, very petite woman, but often had her hair dyed in sort of bright colours and was memorable, I suppose.
She came to London in 2012. London was obviously at that time, it was the world's attention was on London because of the 2012 Olympics. So the city would have been, seen as exciting probably. However, she didn't come for the Olympics. She came for love. She'd met her boyfriend Thomas via an online chat room.
He was somewhat older than her, and he was a tall, blue-eyed, handsome man, and they had a good online relationship. And then when she came over here and actually met him in the flesh, the romance took off, and within a short time they were renting a flat together.
She came to London, where no doubt she was hopeful of finding a good life, like many come from Eastern European over the last few years, looking for excitement in a big city from a small Polish village. So I guess she would have been naive in that respect.
They settled in Harlesden. She gets a nice job in a Polish delicatessen. The staff and boss really pleased with her, really pleased with her work.
Her friends there described her as, friendly, a good worker, a good friend really.
Thomas Kocic by now is working as a forklift driver. And it seems quite idyllic at this point. It seems that everything's okay. Polish people, when they come to London, fit in really quickly and really well. Many Polish young men quickly find employment. There's a significant Polish community working in construction. They get work really quickly, they work very hard, they work long hours, and they fit into a London lifestyle quite quickly. This is a really important piece because it'd have been important for her. She'd have been meeting people from the Polish community, and I'm sure it helped her to settle in when she first arrived.
I guess the first sign that anything was amiss was when the Vent Camelot, Marta's boss at the supermarket, received a text message from her saying that she would have to give up her job because she had to go back to Poland where her mother was ill.
Now, this is really unusual behaviour that her boss thinks this is completely out of character. And bearing in mind she only lived around the corner, she could have popped in and explained. But she doesn't do that.
This is the supermarket where Marta worked, and she lived just a very short walk in that direction from here. And this is like the heart of the Polish community in Harlesden, and they're very close-knit. And when she didn't turn up for work and she hadn't been to tell the manager that she wasn't going to come in, then that's when people's suspicions got aroused, and they really started to fear that something had happened to her. Ava, who was Marta's mother, still living back in Poland, became concerned that she wasn't getting the daily phone calls from Marta, and she tried to initiate contact by phoning her and sending her texts, and she got no replies and couldn't get through on the phone.
Although Marta was living in the capital, she kept in close contact with her mother and phoned her every day. They'd have long chats on the phone, and she was a much-loved daughter, and they had a great relationship. So when her mum didn't hear from her, she was immediately suspicious. She thought, well, where is Marta? Why haven't I been able to get hold of her? And she contacted Thomas, thinking that there'd be some rational explanation. Maybe she'd lost her phone or something like that.
It would appear that the last time anyone spoke to her was on the 28th of April. 2 days later, Marta's mother was ringing her. She got through to Kocic, having been unable to contact her daughter, and asked her where Marta had gone.
And Thomas told her that Marta and he had split up. He said that they'd both gone off to work as usual one morning, and he came home and she'd cleared out and she'd gone, and he didn't know where she was. And Ava, Marta's mother, asked Thomas to take steps to find her, to look for her, and he told her, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to look for her. She obviously needs the space, and if she wants to come back, she'll come back, but otherwise I can't chase her.
But that didn't placate Marta's mum. She knew that her daughter wouldn't have done something like that, so she got in touch with some cousins who went looking for Marta. They were determined to find out what had happened to her, but although they searched everywhere, they couldn't find a trace of her anywhere.
After meeting Thomas online, Marta came over to the UK, and it was here at number 7 Buckingham Road in Harleston that they set up home together. She was close to a thriving Polish community and indeed worked at a Polish supermarket just 400 yards from this flat. It was in this flat, though, that she was murdered. And the last time that she left here, it was in a suitcase.
One of her only flags here is that not long prior to her disappearance, she had changed her Facebook notice from in a relationship to it's complicated. Now that is a sign of things going significantly wrong.
They were together for about 3 years, and during that time it wasn't just all bliss and all happiness. There was a degree of jealousy on Thomas's part. And he would, question her about what she'd been doing, who she'd been seeing, go through her phone and things like that, because he feared that she was being unfaithful to him, which there was absolutely no reason for him to think.
So although she'd hoped for a happy ending, her life was one of being controlled. Her colleagues said that Thomas would wait outside work for her. He'd be checking up when she finished. He'd be calling her constantly. She described him as very controlling.
Marta's whole life, whole world, was managed by Kocik in the context of where she worked, who she saw, when she saw them. There was very little for her. She had very little opportunity to spread her wings and really experience life in London.
His jealousy and the disagreements between them sometimes led to violence, and she would suffer at his hands from a degree of domestic violence. But it's something that she never discussed with her friends or indeed her family.
To someone more worldly, the danger signals were in there by this point. But to Marta, her young age, and given that she'd come from such a fairly closeted background in a small village in Poland, quite clearly she didn't read the warning signs while they were there. Worse was to come, because Kocik seems to have been extremely violent towards her.
After some time, it became clear that Kocik had a darker side of his life, and that was a reliance or an addiction to amphetamine drugs. These drugs are behaviour changing. They're highly addictive. They would draw resources from their lifestyle, and it's quite clear that Kocik was going to continue. His addiction was getting control of him, and as a result of that, he's controlling Marta's life and not allowing her in any way, any shape or form, to be able to step away from him.
People say, the people who knew them, that describe him becoming uninterested in himself. He didn't wash, he didn't clean the flat. More sinister than that was that he seemed to develop an obsession with Marta. He became a jealous, controlling, manipulative figure. So much so that he wouldn't even let her walk back from work alone. He demanded that she would stay at the shop where she worked until he arrived to accompany her home. On one occasion, he actually went to the shop and demanded to see CCTV to actually prove that she'd been there working that day. Such were his insecurities and jealous tendencies.
It's difficult because Kocik is not allowing Marta to develop a network of people who she could rely on, who she could step out to, who she could then explain what's going on. He knew that his lifestyle would eventually lead Marta to either want to leave him or some issue that where she would then gain trust or tell other people, tell her friends, and There was no way he would allow that to happen.
On Good Friday 2015, so we're looking 3 years after Marta had come to London, there was an incident which, in hindsight, I think perhaps it could have saved her, but their flatmate saw Marta. She saw that she had a bloodshot eye, and she'd heard screams and shouts, and she actually asked Marta if she was okay, if the relationship with Kochik was okay, and she invited her to talk about what she was obviously going through. I mean, this kind of coercive control, violence. I mean, she was literally under the spell of a violent lunatic. Marta must have been in denial because she said that there was nothing wrong with her relationship with Kochik. She claimed that this injury to her eye had been caused when a bit of glass from her spectacles were broken off, which was clearly patently untrue. Within, a little over 3 weeks later, Marta was dead.
Grand Union Canal comes into London at its northwest boundaries and runs through all the way into central London, down virtually parallel with the Edgware Road, eventually to Little Venice and through Camden. It was, of course, once a waterway which was used for commerce, but nowadays is really used only by narrow boats, which are there for as pleasure craft or indeed for people to live on.
It runs along effectively a west to east traction, and its community will be people who live on houseboats in certain sort of areas where they're able to dock and they're able to moor up for long periods of time. There's a tow path runs along much of it, so it's popular with walkers and joggers and people of that type. Obviously, originally it would have been a commercial part of life in that part of London.
So it was here on the canal in Little Venice, as it's known, Delamere Terrace, where the suitcase containing Marta's body finally was discovered. It resurfaced here, and somebody on one of the narrow boats heard a tapping on the hull, and they went to investigate. They thought it was a piece of wood or some sort of floating rubbish, but of course it was a suitcase.
The suitcase is floating effectively, and poking out the side of the suitcase is some bright red hair. Now, one of the significant things about Marta is that she used to dye her hair sort of fiery red colours. Of course, at this stage, nobody knew what this was, but the people in the boat get hold of the suitcase and pull it and retrieve it to the side. And they're concerned enough to think there may be somebody in it, so they call the police.
The police fished out the suitcase and inside found the body of a woman in the fetal position, wrapped in a white curtain in bin liners. So it was obvious that she'd been murdered. However, they didn't know who she was at that point. This woman hadn't been reported missing.
In some ways, this finding of a decomposed body in a suitcase in water is one of the worst situations for an investigative team to try to find out what's happened, because the decomposition and the water mean that the scientific evidence you can get from the body is going to be limited. You've got the first hurdle to cross or to jump is who is she? And the old maxim, tell me how they lived and I'll tell you how they died. Well, you can only apply that if you know who the person is and how they've lived. And if you don't know, then in those initial stages of the investigation, which are so important, you haven't got a very important fact, which is who are we dealing with?
There were no missing person reports that matched Marta because Thomas hadn't reported her missing, and by this point Marta's mother and the cousins hadn't got to a point where they could instigate that report.
It's difficult to examine the body because it's all folded up, it's decomposed, the coloration is not what you'd expect, and sometimes that can mask injuries, particularly sort of bruising and even gunshot stab wounds.
But from this point on, what's clear is the preservation of the body has been probably down to the fact that it's been in a cool albeit damp place. So if a body is just submerged in water without anything, it will decompose and it will destroy. It will be destroyed by the water. But in a suitcase, in a kind of cold but damp area, the preservation will last longer due to temperatures and other factors. So the body's recovered and taken to the mortuary for post-mortem examination as to cause of death, and the suitcase is preserved for forensic evidence.
It's remarkable, really, over the years. If you look at cases, then trying to get rid of a body in this way really isn't a good way. They almost always come to the surface. The reason for that is that as the body decomposes, it creates gas, and that gas gives a buoyancy to the body and therefore to the suitcase. And no matter how much weighting you put in there, it will overcome that, and the buoyancy will make it come to the top.
There have been forensic examinations going on with regards to the material that Marta was wrapped in. That have been quite extensive, although difficult because of water. So post-mortem examination, the pathology, toxicology, was Marta in any way intoxicated? Was there any drugs, any alcohol in her system? What was she wearing? What did she die of? There's about, 2, 3, 4 days work there just in that. There were reports that came in that suggested the suitcase had been seen further west on the Grand Union Canal, and this obviously moves the focus of the investigation to not just being around Little Venice where the suitcase is found, but further west and effectively all the way along the Grand Union Canal, because the site of the suitcase entering the water wasn't known initially.
My experience is that trying to recreate what happens to an object when it's put into a body of water is foolish. I've seen trials take place where identical things were put into a river at the same place, and they've ended up at completely different points because of the random nature of currents and obstructions on the bed and the shape of the river and all sorts of things. Because the suitcase with Marta's body in turned up where it did isn't really much of a clue as to where it went in.
This is one of those cases where the police need the media. They need the media's help. There's nothing to identify this person. No details, no missing person report. So that's where the focus of the investigation was, along the canal. Has anybody seen that suitcase? So the media release has to focus on what she looks like, her height, white European female. Does anybody know who she is, who she might be, etc. And in this case, Simon Ashwin decides to make the media release, and it works.
The news reported that a body had been found in the Grand Union Canal, but obviously at that point it was unidentified. However, Thomas then came forward and said that his girlfriend Marta had gone missing.
It was only after there had been newspaper reports about the finding of this body in a suitcase in the Grand Union Canal that Thomas Koschik decided that he probably needed to go and report her to police. And he went and did that, and perhaps not unnaturally, there was an immediate suspicion that he might have something to do with it.
A similar time to the media release going out, members of the public had found ID cards burnt and broken on the route from her address to the Grand Union Canal. It was on the on the path, on the footway. So despite Koschik reporting her missing, the fact that this ID, the identification details had been found, would have identified who she was and led the police to her address in any event. This is the major breakthrough that the investigation needs. This says exactly who she is. More importantly than that, it says exactly where she lived, who he was. And investigation moves into overdrive as to how and where she may have got into the river.
And he went and did that, and perhaps not unnaturally, there was an immediate suspicion that he might have something to do with it. He then gave an account and gave a story from his point of view as to what had happened.
Koschik explains to the police in his report that she was having an affair, she's left him, and that he hasn't seen her for some time. Now, if somebody is going to leave, why don't they take their phones? Why does somebody who's in contact with their mother every day suddenly stop, even if they've left their partner? There's no reason for that. Once she's identified, the investigation would move on to her address. CCTV inquiries around her address were extensive, and that is how you can find exactly when she left that property in that suitcase and who did it. So next door to the flat in Buckingham Road where Marta and Kochik lived is a doctor's surgery, and that surgery had CCTV, and that footage from that camera showed the date, time when Kochik wheeled the very heavy suitcase out of the flat and down the road. That particular piece of footage, timed at 6:30 a.m. on the 1st of May, shows the initial event where Kochik is leaving the flat and taking the suitcase with Marta in it. Subsequent footage along the route shows the timing and where the suitcase was actually placed into the canal. The route from Buckingham Road to close to Mitre Bridge is less than a mile, and under normal circumstances, if someone was to walk that, it would be less than 20 minutes, or about 20 minutes to walk that. It took significantly longer because of the struggle Kochik was having pulling the suitcase with Marta in it.
The big telling here was not only that he was struggling with a suitcase, because he could have been going down to the local tube station to go down to Heathrow, going on holiday, but the fact that he goes in the direction he's seen almost at the Grand Union Canal, and then he's seen coming back on the same cameras without the suitcase. So it's here on the Mitre Bridge over the Grand Union Canal that Thomas deposited the suitcase containing Marta's body. If you look over there, there are some really steep steps. I think to struggle down those with a suitcase with a body would be out of the question. But next to it, you've got the Z walkway, like a slipway for wheelchair use and things like that, and I think it would be easy to wheel a case down there. And there you see there's access to within about 10 inches of the surface of the canal, so it's an ideal spot to dispose of something. You'll see from the surface of the water there is a very weak current that goes in that direction, and yet it was a considerable distance away from here, down in Little Venice, that the suitcase containing Marta's body was eventually found, eventually came to the surface.
One of the significant things about where the suitcase goes into the Grand Union Canal is the fact that this isn't residential. This is commercial area and industrial parts of the canal, very quiet, and particularly this time of the morning. It goes down by the side of the bridge. It can be seen on CCTV. Although you can't see the suitcase go in, you can see him go down by the side of the bridge. The suitcase undoubtedly goes into the canal at that point. He can be seen re-emerging up with his trousers wet, making his way away without the suitcase, and effectively just gets a drink and makes his way home.
The circumstances around Marta's death are still have never been proved with 100% certainty. But what is suspected is that she met her death in the most horrific fashion imaginable. It would appear that the last time anyone spoke to her was on the 28th of April. 2 days later, Marta's mother was ringing her. She got through to Kochik, having been unable to contact her daughter, and asked her where Marta had gone. Kochik claimed at that point that she had left, in words which I find quite horrific, actually, given what later transpired. He said that she needed her own space.
Between the 28th and the 1st of May, when we know Kochik was seen on CCTV wheeling a 3 foot high, 2 foot wide black canvas suitcase out of the property and then off towards the Grand Union Canal. During those few days, we're confident that that's when Marta was subjected to extreme violence, causing multiple fractures to her face, her hands.
Does that mean that he was keeping her prisoner at home for those days when her mother had called on April the 30th? So was she unconscious? Was she dying at that time when her mother was trying to contact her? I mean, these are the questions that have never been answered, and there's only one person that can answer them, and that's Kojic.
And as police started to piece the evidence together, they'd found he'd gone to extraordinary steps to try and cover his tracks. Marta's Polish identity card and bank card were found cut up and burnt along the route to the canal, which illustrates that Thomas had made a conscious effort to try and erase all trace of her.
The deception part of Kojic's behaviour and control shows a real sinister side to what Kojic is doing. Knowing he's killed her, setting about a course of conduct to deceive others, her family, her work, and it shows evidentially later on would disprove any nonsense about the fact that she'd left of her own accord and been murdered by someone else.
We know that not only did Kojic use Marta's phone to text her boss, but he also used it to access her Facebook account.
He contacted a friend of Marta's called Anna on 50 occasions from her Facebook Messenger, again pretending to be Marta, claiming that she was now outside of London, that she left Kojic, and then bizarrely suggesting that she and Kojic might like to enjoy a threesome. I mean, was that fantasy? Was he pouring salt into the wounds here? This is one of her best friends. She'll remember that conversation, although it was on Facebook Messenger forever.
These actions, this contact via Facebook of Anna, shows a level of deception, a purposeful level of deception, to try and convince others that Marta's still alive and he's nothing to do with her going missing.
Kojic must have known it was just a matter of time before her body was discovered. After all, he'd left her floating inside a suitcase on the Grand Union Canal. He was quite clearly trying to cover his tracks, making these suggestions that she was still alive. But it all started to unravel when her body was discovered inside the suitcase.
What happens is, in my view, is Kojic decides, once he sees the media appeal, there's probably pressure from the cousins. Where is she? Report her missing. And so he decides, I'm going to have to report her missing and run with my story.
Clearly, Kojic becomes the first suspect when police are called. I mean, the first prime suspect, the only suspect. And he was immediately arrested.
Following arrest, Kojic maintained a defence of not guilty in the context that he said Marta had left him. She was having an affair and had left him. And it was nothing to do with him. But 2 days after that, he was charged with her murder.
Thomas was a coward right to the end. He maintained that he was innocent of murder. It had just been a sex game gone wrong. They'd both been... It was a drug-fuelled kind of romp, and he hadn't meant for her to die. It was all an accident, and then he was left with no other option but to dispose of her body. But the reality was this was pre-planned. He'd been controlling right from the start, and poor Martin never stood a chance.
That form of defence is trying to change any form of murder or manslaughter accusation to unlawful burying or denying a person a lawful burial type of offence, which is much, much more minor.
But for him to try to have that as the offence for which he's convicted and he's happy to plead guilty to, the sole motivation for him is to try to reduce the sentence he'll get, because he's not going to get a life sentence. And even if he got a custodial sentence, it would be, single-digit number of years, if that. So the difference between that and murder for how his life goes on from that point is very stark.
At one stage during the trial, he suggests that he came home and found her dead on the sofa. There's some suggestion it was after a night of violent sex.
He said to revive her, did CPR and so forth and couldn't. And he said it was at that point that he panicked because he thought he would be blamed because he'd supplied the drugs, the amphetamines and other drugs that she'd been taking, and that he would get blamed for her death and it wasn't really his fault. And so his solution to that was to try and get rid of her body by throwing it in the canal in a suitcase.
Again, complete nonsense. If that's the case, phone an ambulance. Phone a doctor, phone the police. Why'd you put her in a suitcase and put her in a canal? All of these kind of things are last-minute survival antics of a murderer. Post-mortem is done by a pathologist, Nat Carey, arguably one of the best in the world, frankly, in my experience. And he says his findings are that it's feasible that when Marta was put in the suitcase, she was still alive.
The pathologist examined the body and found that she'd suffered hypothermia and bruising as well.
Bruising, which only takes place when the body is alive, because you need blood to be pumping for bruising to occur. And she had extensive bruising, more than might have been expected from an assault. And he suggested that a source of this could be while she was being wheeled along to the Grand Union Canal, or even once the suitcase was in the Grand Union Canal, she might have been struck by a boat, and that caused this bruising.
The horrible, inescapable conclusion there is that she was still alive, perhaps unconscious, while she was zipped up in that suitcase and literally froze to death. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything worse. So, he must have known that he was killing her. Perhaps he thought he already had killed her, but she was unconscious. We'll never know. But all in all, it is one of the most sadistic things I think I'd have ever heard of.
I've absolutely no doubt that Koshik's intention was that this suitcase would sink to the bottom of the Grand Union Canal and would be lost forevermore and never resurface.
Not content with taking her life, he then destroyed her reputation, or tried to destroy her reputation, during his trial at the Old Bailey, in an attempt to explain the violence that she suffered at his hands. The reports from the flatmate about, screams and yells and turning up the music to cover up the sounds of him attacking her. He tried to explain that away by saying that they enjoyed S&M sex, and that they would yell at each other, and that sometimes she was the dominant partner, sometimes he was the dominant partner. This was complete nonsense.
If it was a violent, consensual sex accident, and in my experience in policing of over 30 years, and much of that in homicide, serious crime, there aren't many people who consent to being beaten up or bashed and beaten with blunt instruments in some form of sex gratification. What this is cover for violent men who beat women, whether that be during sex or just beat women. They then use some violent sex story and process that they've seen on unpleasant porn sites, and they think somehow that's normal.
In November 2015, Thomas Kochik was found guilty of murder and ordered to serve a minimum of 18.5 years. Judge Nicholas Hilliard QC told Kochik, "Your actions were carefully considered and designed at all times to help you to get away with murder if you could."
When he's released from prison, he'll be in his mid-50s. That's younger than I am now. There's no confession. There's no remorse. This is all about deception. Right up to the trial, we're still trying to create a false alibi of some kind. So the sentence does not match the brutality of the murder. The family and society need courts and judges to see, to properly get it. And in this case, this particular case, 18.5 years is tariff for that murder is just ridiculous, frankly. Until that sentence, that type of sentence and that kind of violence is 30 years minimum, I can't see where the deterrent is.
I thought, given what he'd done and the danger he poses to women, I felt that was a bit light, personally, and that really, for taking her life in the way he did, and the danger that he could still clearly represent to women, he should have got 30.
This wasn't a domestic murder which happened in the heat of the moment. It was something where it looks like Marta was murdered kind of over a period of days. And, you can only imagine the feelings, the fear that she must have suffered during that time. And then Kocic has gone on afterwards to do his absolute best to cover up what he'd done in a, quite a cunning and detailed way. I think there's lots of people that would say that 18.5 years as his recommended tariff is on the lenient side, and I'd agree with that.
How does society manage violence, controlling behaviour, murder against young women, if that's the outcome when you hear the evidence against him? It's very difficult to work in the industry that I've worked in for many years and see that as an outcome. It certainly doesn't feel very satisfactory.
She had no idea of what he was really like, and again, I suppose it's a sort of serves as perhaps a salutary lesson that the person you meet online on the internet, do you really know what that person is until you actually meet them? Biggest mistake was to go online and be unlucky enough to come across Thomas Kocic. Now, sometimes people say that with the internet, if you're looking to meet someone, the odds are good that you will actually meet someone. The problem is the goods can be a little bit odd on occasion, and Kocic went beyond this. I mean, she literally landed in the lap of a monster.
This woman had come over from Poland looking for love, thinking she'd met the man of her dreams and she was going to live a life of happiness, happy ever after. But in reality, she ended up beaten, trussed up and thrown into a canal in the most brutal way, and who knows what horrors she endured in her final moments.
It's another one of a whole tragic sort of litany of cases where a woman is subject to domestic violence and coercive control and controlling behaviour in a relationship, and that leads in the end to murder. And it's very difficult to encourage women in Marta's position to shout out before it gets too late, before it gets to that stage. I was talking to a young detective officer a couple of years ago, and she told me that she had 120 cases of domestic violence on her workload. I said, how do I tell which one's going to escalate to murder? I said, virtually you can't, and that's the difficulty we have. It's trying to use models and risk assessments to understand where the risk is. But that too is not an exact science, and you can't prevent every single one of these, sadly.
Mickey Calvi was an armed robber. Not only was he an armed robber, but his wife, Linda, was also an armed robber. They went out on blags together.
Linda Calvi was a very beautiful woman. She was very charismatic. She commanded a lot of respect, but men were enthralled by her.
Ronnie Cook, he was a lifetime villain. He was an armed robber of some repute, known as such within the community.
It's almost a kind of a socialist philosophy that money is there and it's not ours, and the only way we can ever get money is by taking it. And she bought into that.
This was a very unusual set of circumstances, very unusual murder. The fact that someone had come out of prison on day release and was shot dead tends to think it was not an accident.
It was a crime of almost breathtaking cowardice.
The audio was too graphic to be
Justice burning lost the smell of body in the bedroom.
The life sentence may provide
9
some
men were
closure
killed
for
when the
the
inferno swept through the building that housed
young women unable to defend themselves. The man who tried to kill her will never be free to harm again.
Colin Sutton was a Detective Chief Inspector and Senior Investigating Officer in the Metropolitan Police. He led the investigations into some of the most complex and high-profile cases ever, bringing dangerous criminals to justice.
Then heard screaming. The Night Stalker wins out the attack. Another 146 victims.
In this series, he will take you inside complex cases and show you how the detectives caught the criminals. This is The Real Manhunter.
now been found guilty on all 29 of those charges. Oldest victim 89.
The officer in charge described it as a senseless
The life
tragedy.
sentence may provide some closure for his victims' families.
Ian Corner, Detective Constable, Metropolitan Police, from 1983 to 2013. I can remember exactly what I was doing. I was Detective Constable at the time at Plaistow Police Station. I'd just returned back to work after a period of leave.
My name's Joe Locke. At the time of this case, I was still a trainee detective. I hadn't reached the rank of Detective Constable. I was working at Lehman Street Police Station, and I was in the main office. And at that time, they didn't have a homicide command like we know of nowadays. They used to come round and second people from CID offices to work on major inquiries. I was fortunate enough to be seconded on this particular inquiry.
I think to hold yourself up in the East End of London, in places like Plaistow and Canning Town and North Woolwich and them sort of places, and down Step, Whitechapel and that, as a cop, as a CID officer, you probably had to have a bit about you. You know, you weren't dealing with shrinking violence here. You know, they were people who were highly motivated and would confront things. You know, they wouldn't back down to anything. They would confront things nose to nose because they had to, because the people they were dealing with were of similar ilk. There wasn't a fantastic amount of difference between the police and some well-organised criminals, really, to be honest with you. They're all the same sort of character.
It's quite interesting, really, to look at what the culture was like in the 60s and 70s in the east of London. You had people who weren't particularly well off, and so their morality, if you like, was that to have things you couldn't otherwise afford by illicit means was actually okay. There were certain crimes that were, you know, off the scale and not tolerated, specifically sexual crimes, crimes against children. But any kind of dishonesty offence, really, as long as the victim wasn't one of your own, as long as the victim was a company or a bank or something, then it was okay. And, you know, you had virtually everybody, every working class person around would know somebody down the pub who could get clothing or electrical goods or whatever, and whether they were pilfered from the docks or whether it was just, you know, handled from a burglary or something like that.
Police were different in those days, insofar as that, because they were different. You know, everyone's a product of their environment, and you know, generations change. You look at, you know, I think people look at police now and you think about computers and technology and all that sort of stuff. None of that was there.
And one of the interesting things, still into the 80s, when I started policing, was that if you went to Crown Court, Snaresbrook Crown Court, which a lot of East London cases went to, it was almost impossible to get a conviction for dishonestly handling stolen goods for receiving. And that's because the jury, by and large, said, well, that's how life works. That's not a crime, is it? You know, it's that sort of situation. And I'm reminded of the great Daddy Baker, who made a comment once about Only Fools and Horses. And he said when he saw that the first time, he thought it was a documentary, not a comedy, because that's what life was like.
I was just early turn CID in the office at Lehman Street, where I was working at the time. And my DCI came up to me and said, we're going to second you onto this unit working out of North Woolwich for this murder of Ronnie Cook. You'll get a briefing when you get there. And that was all I knew about it at the time.
I think on the way down we'd had a briefing. It was like this guy had been shot, which was on day release from prison. If you got a murder in those days, they would just tip everybody out. The main CID officer would have been early turn CID, dealing with the day-to-day, you know, criminal work, dealing with prisoners in custody, dealing with burglaries, robberies, whatever. And yeah, we just got called down there and we just jumped in the car. Like we would go down in the car 4 or 5-handed. And what you'd do, you'd get there on an inquiry like that and you'd literally flood the air with detectives. You know, you'd start knocking on doors, you'd start looking around, see what's about. We got to the scene and there was some people down. They were holding the property. I knew that Ronnie Cook was inside. He'd been shot. We tried not to disturb the scene, so obviously because the scene was going to be vital, blood and other forensic opportunities. These are the pre-DNA days, remember? So, you know, you're looking at freezing a scene, you're looking at getting photographers in at a very early stage, you're looking at getting what they call the lab liaison sergeant at a very early stage to see what opportunities there are.
I was part of the investigation team. I mean, literally, if you was part of the investigation team, you'd be allocated all sorts of things. Take statements from this person, take statements from that person, go and do house-to-house inquiries, go and knock on doors. You know, if someone's phoned in with a bit of information, go and speak to them. That would be what I would do, along with all the other people there, apart from what they called the sergeant, who was the office manager. He would do the day-to-day run, the SIO, the exhibits officer. They would have their separate roles.
You have to put the investigation into the murder of Ronnie Cook into the context of the time. It was 1990. DNA testing, profiling was in its real infancy. It hadn't come mainstream at all. It was known about by scientists and had been used in 1 or 2 cases. But, you know, these officers and their scientific colleagues were relying on traditional means of, you know, fibres, fingerprints, gunshot residues, ballistic examination, that sort of thing. There was no CCTV, or very little CCTV in London, and this was in Canning Town, and, you know, there wasn't anything there. There were no mobile phones. Again, they were in existence, but they weren't widespread, and the techniques of triangulation and using mobile phone call data and location data to assist investigations wasn't there. So it was a real traditional investigation in that sense. It was investigation as had been taking place for probably the previous 20 or 30 years, with nothing else to help it.
All we know is that this guy had been shot. Ronnie Cook, who was an armed robber, had been shot. Linda Calvi, who also had previous convictions, was there when he was shot. That's what we were told. And it was like starting from scratch. We had nothing.
This was a very unusual set of circumstances, very unusual murder. The fact that someone had come out of prison on day release and was shot dead tends to think it's not an accident, or it's not, they're not in the wrong place at the wrong time. So, if you know what I mean. There was an awful lot of background filling needed, and what was quite interesting was that, so we were talking to various characters, whether they be witnesses, whether they be from what would be called now the underworld, from the criminal world, criminal fraternity, and it was quite interesting because on one hand you see Mr. Cook had got to prison and for an armed robbery sometime before, so it was almost like time had frozen for him a little bit. So you were looking at a lot of what we were doing was maybe 10 years before, 12 years before, so we were going back and forward all the time, so it was quite unique.
As far as everything accounted for, Cook was a family man, but obviously he had a deep and dark past and deep and dark present at that time.
I mean, Ronnie Cook was a good class criminal from South East and East London. Quite an interesting guy, was a career armed robber in the 70s into the 80s, had served quite a few prison sentences. His family came out of East London, although he did a lot of his criminality and work sort of South East London.
He was a prolific armed robber. He met Linda Calvi at a funeral of a friend of his called Mickey Calvi, Linda's husband, and from there he started having an affair with Linda.
Well, Linda is an East End girl who, born in Ilford, but literally spent her life in the East End.
Linda Calvi was born as Linda Welford in Ilford in 1948, but her family moved closer towards the centre of London, and she grew up really around Stepney Green area. Now, this is the East End in the 50s and 60s. You know, it was the preserve of criminal gangs, notably the Krays, but the whole of London had gangs like the Richardsons, Frasers and things like that. And you sort of got these pockets of where trust in your friends and trust not to grass, to spill the beans, to tell the police about what had been going on was paramount. And so it's kind of an area where perhaps she grew up with values and a sort of moral code slightly different to the mainstream. She went to work age 16 as a receptionist at a paint factory, but she was an attractive young girl and grew into an attractive woman. And just completely by chance, she went to a party, or was asked to go to a party, which was in aid of an armed robber called Mickey Calvi, who was coming to the end of his prison sentence, and the party actually was to sort of celebrate that. But it was actually while he was still in prison. He was on day release at this party.
You don't quite know why a good girl goes bad, but she was your classic gangster's mole. I suppose if you're looking for examples in history of the Bonnie and Clyde, then Linda and her husband, Mickey Calvey, fitted that mould. No doubt they lived pretty well on the proceeds of their crimes until it all went wrong.
I think it's fair to say that Linda just saw him and started speaking to him and fell in love. And they were married a couple of years later when she was 22. And she was now really into the underworld, this sort of gang culture. Mickey was an armed robber. He made no secret in those circles of the fact everyone knew that he was an armed robber. And Linda knew this and understood that, you know, that was the way he made his money.
Linda and Mickey Calvey were a love match. The Bonnie and Clyde, you could say, of the East End. She was his yin and to his yang. They were very much together. It was a love match, and they wanted to be top dogs, and they were going to make sure they were. So everything they plotted together. She was his right-hand woman. So when he'd go out on jobs, she would help plan them. She was a getaway driver initially. She was there at all the meetings when they devised these complex plots of how they were going to raid post offices.
They married in 1970. And you've got to remember, back then, the East End, the Crays had been sentenced the previous year to life imprisonment for Jack the Hat murder, George Cornell. This gang, the firm, had been rolled up by the police. Society was then faced with this new emerging threat from the armed robber. And in some ways, this sort of the decline of the old gangs, as it were, sort of heralded this new crime phenomenon, which was the armed robber.
The Calveys had 2 children, and in those days you would expect Linda to maybe cooking tea for when her husband came home from his jobs of holding up post offices. But that's certainly not the case. It couldn't be further from the truth. Linda was in a class of her own. Her role was unique. She wasn't the sort of person to be picking up a recipe book by Delia Smith. She was the kind to be picking up a shotgun and going to the post offices and forcing people at gunpoint to hand over hard-earned takings.
Theirs was literally a marriage which was born in crime, in the sense that Linda had married Mickey while he was behind bars at Wandsworth Prison. She waited for him, he got out, and then they went on these crimes together. She was literally part of the gang. Everything, their criminal careers flourished as things did in the 70s. It was the age of the armed robber until 1978, and he was shot dead by a police marksman in ambush.
This affected Linda profoundly. Not only, of course, she'd lost her husband, the love of her life, to a shooting, but that the investigation into that shooting afterwards was, she thought, at odds with what really must have happened. She knew from that morning that Mickey had taken a gun with him, which he was going to wave around, but she said she knows wasn't loaded. And the evidence from the police officer that shot him was that the gun was pointed at him and that Mickey had threatened him with the gun, and the police officer said, I feared for my life, I feared for the life of those around me, and so I shot him, and he died. And of course, with that being a reasonable belief, that would be, and was adjudged, a completely lawful killing. However, Linda had a second postmortem done on Mickey's body, and the evidence from that seemed to imply that he might have been shot from the back rather than the front, and that the injury that killed him was inflicted by a shot whilst he was running away, rather than confronting somebody with a gun. And Linda would point out, the gun had nothing in it. Running these investigations in these sorts of gangs is difficult because the witnesses with whom you're dealing are also from the gangs. You might have the odd eyewitness or neighbour who heard something or saw something, but ultimately, to crack this case, you're going to have to sit down with armed robbers and criminals and ask them to help you. And while they might do, if the circumstances are right and they feel that, you know, what they're doing isn't grassing as such, but it's helping to deal with somebody who's broken their code as they see it. You still have to remember all the time that these people have this right in and out relationship with the truth and facts, and you have to ask yourself, what's in it for them? Why are they telling me this? Why are they helping me with this? You know, is it something that gets them credit within a certain part of a certain gang, and does it help them? They will probably want to find an angle for themselves, or else they just won't talk to you.
It wasn't an easy inquiry to get witnesses to. It wasn't an easy inquiry to elicit information and background of people. So it took time to cultivate people to give over that information, to give over that history, to give over the history of the personalities. So you've got to keep working on it. If you put a job like that away till trial, you'll lose it. Simple as that.
Linda Calvey was a very beautiful woman. She was very charismatic. She commanded a lot of respect, but men were enthralled by her. And one of those that were caught in a way in her aura and enchanted by her was Ronnie Cook. Ronnie Cook had been an associate, a best friend, if you like, of her husband, Mickey. And it was actually at Mickey's funeral. So while she was grieving her husband, her eye was also turned by Ronnie Cook. And they quickly struck up a relationship, which developed into a full-blown affair. Ronnie would wine and dine Linda, take her to the best restaurants, buy her fur coats. She had the best that money could buy, and there was a lot of money because there was a lot of crime.
She then started up this relationship with Cook, and it was obviously a very serious relationship. He was married with children. She had 2 children by Calvey, Mickey Calvey. So, and I have to say, around Cook, he had a wife, kids, and he wasn't very nice. Apparently his wife didn't even have enough for a coat. In the meantime, he's taken Linda Calvey to Las Vegas. They went to Spain, they went to Greece. They really lived a high life.
So while Ronnie's wife struggled to bring up their 2 children, their 2 girls, he was lavishing attention on Linda Calvey, who had the best of everything.
Ronnie became really controlling and really unpleasant to Linda, but was so threatening, and she felt could back it up, that she felt she had no choice but to keep the relationship going. And this included him making veiled or actually not so veiled threats against her son, Neil. Ronnie Cook had an acquaintance, a neighbour, called Brian Thorogood. Brian Thorogood wasn't really a criminal. He wasn't part of one of these gangs, but Ronnie Cook obviously trusted him well enough to let him into the secret, if you like. And they were literally having a social evening one night, and Brian asked him, what do you really do for a living then? And he came out with it and said, I rob banks and post offices. And Brian at first thought Ronnie was joking, and then realised that he wasn't. And he said, yeah, okay, I'm cool with that. And because he was so trusted, he became part of the gang and of it.
Ronnie Cook got arrested doing an armed robbery. They used a mechanical digger to take the roof off the security van. He then went to prison for a long time. As a result of him going to prison, some money, so it's purported, was given to Linda Calvey to look after for him, that he was going to claim when he came out of prison. And in the meantime, while he was in prison, he introduced her to a chap called Brian Thorogood, who was another armed robber and ne'er-do-well. And he had a haulage business in Grays, in Essex.
Brian Thorogood has now kind of taken over the role in the gang and also the role in caring for Linda. And it's interesting that there's this culture again that is such that Linda's a really, really tough woman who's been planning and executing armed robberies, and yet there's this feeling she always needs a man to look after her. And I'm sure she really did. But Brian's taking that role on.
Linda Calvey started an affair with Brian Thorogood, and then Brian Thorogood got arrested and locked up for a considerable amount of time. Brian Thorogood arranged for her to meet with a fellow called Danny Reese, who was, while Brian Thorogood was in prison, was Brian Thorogood's nasty dog.
Where that all ends up is that Linda's partner, Ronnie Cook, is in prison, but at that time she is then having relationships both with Brian Thorogood and with Daniel Reese. And the situation is even more complicated by the fact that she is looking after a large sum of money on behalf of Ronnie Cook, and she's spent and used some of that money, and it's not all there.
Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister at the time, and Linda Calvi was an equally powerful character within her own small circles, so it's very unusual to get a woman that would dominate these criminal circles like this, and she forged everything around herself. She was a driving force. There was must have been an aura or a magnetism about her for men such as Ronnie Cook to fall under her spell, and that's quite literally what happened.
Linda was on a countdown to doom from the start. She'd been given a vast sums to hold on to from robberies, and her biggest fear was that Ronnie would realise how much money she'd spent. It had gone, she'd frittered it away, an expensive lifestyle. She'd also been having relationships with other men, including Danny Reese. She was terrified this would come out. Once Ronnie discovered that she'd spent the money, he would start questioning her loyalty to him. Ronnie wasn't the sort to take prisoners. Her fate would have been sealed.
Cook was meanwhile in prison, and from 1981, you flash forward there to 1990. He's now done 9 years, and he's starting to be released on home leave, and this creates a big problem for Linda Calvi. She has not only been sleeping with his pals, his criminal cronies behind his back, but she's also tucked into all his lolly, which he's been obviously looking forward to claiming once he's released from prison. She quite clearly had the wool pulled over his eye completely, because it does seem extraordinary that a man like that would have trusted anyone with his criminal money.
There's no doubt Linda was a very sort of gregarious and affable person. So as Ronnie Cook approaches the end of his long prison sentence, she's got a dilemma. She's got a problem, because she's got this violent, controlling man who she's meant to be in a relationship with, who's coming out of prison, and he's coming out of prison to find that she's been having relationships with 2 other men concurrently while he's been in prison, and she's been spending his money without his say-so. And that's the position she was in as Ronnie Cook approached the end of his prison sentence. Now, Daniel Reese, again, wasn't really an armed robber or part of the gang, but he'd suffered tragedy in his life because his son had been killed in a car crash.
He was a Rottweiler. That's the way I describe him. He was a huge man.
Danny Reese has become Linda Calvi's lover, and he ended up in prison himself. He was in the Verne down in Dorset, where people would typically go to finish off a sentence, actually.
Ronnie Cook is approaching the end of his sentence, and as is common, he's given day release. Linda goes to the prison, picks him up, and takes him to her house, and literally 30 minutes after he's released from prison on this day release, he's murdered. So how did this happen?
Obviously, there's witnesses, or alleged witnesses at the scene. Linda Calvi was taken away to be interviewed as a witness, because obviously with what she was saying and what had happened, she was a bystander when some guy burst in and shot Cook. So there was that going on. So there was a lot going on. We did a lot of work around the locality, tracing neighbours, passers-by, that sort of stuff. And quite surprisingly, there was quite a few people who were quite willing to speak to us, because they didn't really know what was going on. Everybody had heard these gunshots, and obviously it was quite disturbing, even in the East End of London.
So we're talking about Canning Town here. It's a tough area. People look out for each other, and they certainly don't speak to the police at all. It's not something they routinely do. They'd probably not answer the door if they saw it was the police knocking on it. However, the level of brutality in this case, and the fact that they had no idea that Linda Calvi was living next door, meant they did make a statement to the police. They explained that they'd seen a man outside lying down in a hollow, and they were very credible witnesses.
The first thing she said was that there was a gunman in the house when she got home with Ronnie. She later changed that story a bit to that she was at home with Ronnie in the house and the gunman burst in through the door and shot him.
So straight away you're thinking, right, well, it's a hit, isn't it? It's not, this ain't someone who's come in to rob the telly or the video. This is a hit. So straight away you think, okay, so how does he get to the hit? Well, who knows he's going to that location? He didn't just turn up there. So straight away there's a suspicion around her, isn't there? So we had a jaundiced view a little bit of whatever, but you are suspicious. Look, I mean, if you tell that story to anybody that knows nothing about the characters, the first thing you're going to say was, how did that guy know that he was going to be here at that time? Someone's coming out of prison on day release. I mean, Ronnie Cook's family didn't know he was out on day release that day. Not many people knew that. I think she was one of maybe 1 or 2 people. Certainly 2 people. The guy was in the park.
Family lived in Leighton. His daughter, Narissa, she was with a guy called Paul Pemberton. He was the licensee of a pub in Bow called the Widow's Son, and that featured in this inquiry. So I had some dealings with the Widow's Son pub, and it turns out that Ronnie Cook, as I said, was a trustee, and he was on home leave for the weekend, and he went to the Widow's Son pub on the Sunday afternoon with Linda Calvey, and witnesses in the pub confirmed that Danny Reese walked through the pub from the front door to the back door, and to see who Ronnie Cook was, because it would be obvious he was sitting with Linda Calvey, and he had met Linda Calvey several times. So it was identifying Ronnie Cook to know the man who he had to shoot, and that was the recce beforehand. And Danny Reese was on home leave from prison himself for the weekend.
So you've got this woman literally creating the web, the Black Widow creating this web, where the lover who's in the Vernon prison is now the hitman who's going to take out her former lover, whose money she's spent.
Then there was a big kind of green area opposite the location of the offence, which was quite pertinent to it because the alleged suspect had been seen in there jogging around in a tracksuit and stuff like that, and people had thought he was a guy doing, keep fit boxing training, something like that. So, yeah, the green area went round in a bit of a semicircle. And, it was a normal East End residential street.
And a few people saw him, and by all accounts, he was laying prone in a little dip in the ground. You could just about see the front door. You could just see him going in the door. But they might not have seen him, wouldn't have probably seen him looking out. And they wouldn't have, well, certainly Ronnie Cook wouldn't have looked for him.
It's a couple of days later that the investigators realise who Linda is and realise that she's actually a convicted armed robber. She only served about 3.5 years of a 7-year sentence originally for armed robbery. But they realise who she is, that she's this armed robber woman. And they go back and start looking at it more closely, and she becomes the chief suspect, and that's when she's arrested, and it goes on.
There's a guy jogging around a park, big lump of a guy, looked like a boxer, doing boxing training, jogging, in a tracksuit, which wasn't that unusual, The East End is full of boxers, isn't it? It always was, always will be. Plus the gym just along the road, Peacock Gym, that sort of stuff, so it all fits the narrative, So he's in the park doing some training, that sort of stuff. Obviously, when they come home, he goes in and does the deed.
Initially, we didn't have a clue. We didn't know anything. We just thought it was another villain come in, knew he was seeing Linda Calvey, and waited for him. That's what we knew. That's what we initially thought. It was just other things, other information came our way, and we followed that up with a lot of legwork. Identified Danny Reese.
Danny Reese, what I'd say, was one of the original superclasses. He'd been giving information to police and giving evidence about other criminal activities for a reduction in sentence for what he'd been arrested for.
As far as I know, his name was Danny Wood, and he changed his name because of becoming a supercross, which obviously put him in jeopardy himself from other people. That's all I can tell you about that. I don't know the ins and outs of that one. That would have been beyond my pay grade at the time.
We'd got hold of the prison straight away, and obviously we needed his clothing that he'd come back in. Police don't think we're looking at DNA and stuff like that, What you see on Silent Witness didn't happen in 1990. So, obviously, we want his clothing and bits and pieces for things like potential blood, firearms residue, that sort of stuff. So, went there and got his clothing. I didn't go there originally. Officers wanted to speak to him. He refused to speak to anyone, but they agreed to speak to one particular police officer that he'd known for a number of years who wasn't on our inquiry. And they had a history, and so obviously Danny had a trust in a particular police officer, a guy called Dave Sandlin, and asked to see Dave. And he said he was the only person he talked to.
He rolled over under questioning and then came clean, claimed it was Calvey that killed Cook. She, in the meantime, had been sticking to a story that these masked men had burst into the house, but everything fell apart on her.
He was very agitated, from what I remember. He spoke to Dave Standling in the system in prison. In them days, it was slightly different. From what I remember, now you've got the police able to exact pace time, that sort of stuff, but because he was in the system, he was still interviewed in prison. He was a serving prisoner. So he was interviewed, and then he would have been produced later to be charged. I think he'd expected it, you know. They listen, everybody knows what's going on. It's gossip's going around, isn't it? Whatever we were doing was certainly getting filtered back, and you know, we had to be a little bit careful as well. There was a confidentiality around what we did, because there was a few cops in them days that I wouldn't have told things to, you know, and in later years. So, you know, it was all pretty much kept confidential, but I mean, it was a feeding frenzy around it. You know, you had the media, you had various squads turning up, wanting to know this, that and the other, you know. These were all people that were big interest characters to people.
I think it would seem that the whole plan for this was to have Daniel Rees outside the property, maybe seen by somebody, so that it supports the story that Linda was going to give, that I was here with Ronnie, somebody burst in, murdered Ronnie and disappeared. And she had also arranged for a couple to be there with a car to whisk Danny Rees away from the murder scene as quickly as possible.
Linda Calvin put it all together very intricately. She had all the people waiting, because she had the guy waiting to pick him up a couple of streets away in a car and drive him to the station so he could get the train.
He had to get from the scene of the murder in Canning Town to Waterloo Station and on a train to make it back to his prison in Dorset, where he signed in, and it would effectively be his alibi. He would say, look, there is no way on earth I could have got back here in time and have committed that murder in Canning Town at that time. This was all part of the plan. Where the plan went wrong, London traffic. As usual, it took them much longer than they guessed it would to get from Canning Town to Waterloo. Daniel Rees missed his train. He had to get a later train. He's later back to the prison in Dorset, and the whole alibi is blown out of the water. King George Avenue, Custom House, East London. It's in the shadow of the city airport over there now. But in 1991, before the airport came, this was where Linda Calvey had her house. And it was to that house that she brought Ronnie Cook when he had his Sunday day release from prison. Now, Ronnie was expecting an afternoon, evening of home comforts, Sunday roast. But Linda had other plans, because she had secreted Danny Rees in this park opposite her house. And once Linda and Ronnie were in the house, Danny Rees kicked the door in, went in, confronted Ronnie Cook and shot him. Now, he shot him with a shotgun once in the arm. And at that point, Danny Rees lost his nerve. And so Linda Calvey took the gun from him, and she shot Cook in the head while he was kneeling in front of her. The blood spatter analysis proved that that's the position he was in when the shot went in, which killed him.
She had blood spatter on her as well, which would be right because of the shotgun, the blast of the shotgun. But the forensics came back and said it was from the blood spatter of the movement of the air taking the blood back from the blast rather than it splattering over her. And it didn't seem to be, if I recall again, almost like a silhouette of blood where she would have been standing.
If blood is spilt, there's various ways it's spilt. You can have, you know, we used to call it violent blood, blood in action, drip blood, contact trace, that sort of stuff. So what you had was, you know, if you hit someone or shoot someone, something like that, you get a spray of a distribution of blood. And so obviously there was blood distributed on the floors, on the units that would suggest that someone was there when they were shot. You know, that's what the science was then. It wasn't as good as DNA, but I mean, I used blood pattern analysis on murder inquiries later times, and it was very powerful evidence, you know, especially if you had a person said this happened, then you got someone comes in and said, well, the blood says it was there and it's different, and it casts doubts. So that's quite powerful.
I mean, going back into 1990, DNA had really never been heard of. I mean, it was in its infancy, being pioneered, never been used in a criminal case. There was nothing really for the police to go on in terms of forensics at that point. I think later on they recovered a footprint on the carpet.
Her footprint was in blood in certain places that proved she was standing in certain positions and so forth. it was never contested that she was there. She never contested that she wasn't there. Obviously, where she was standing, footprint-wise and stuff like that, footprints in blood show that she was standing in certain places at certain times, and that's obviously post-blood being spilt. I remember at the time, I think for the trial, they did a kind of a computer graphic, as it was, sort of a map, a computer graphic of the scene. I can't remember too much about it, but I mean, that was pretty cutting edge in them days, you know. That was something that your kids now would probably do on an app on their mobile. You know, that was pretty cutting edge stuff. You know, I remember that being, because a big part of the trial was about where people were standing, and you know, it was all about accounts and whether accounts were true. Because you know, this trial there was a lot of circumstantial evidence. And I was going to say there was no smoking gun. Well, of course there was a smoking gun, but there was no final piece of things. So it was a lot of evidence put together, which made it a very difficult and quite dirty trial, to be honest with you.
Now, this scientific evidence of Cook being made to kneel before he was shot by Linda Calvi was backed up by witnesses who were found when police did house-to-house inquiries here, because somebody said they heard a bang, which we assume was the first shot by Danny Reese when he shot Cook in the arm, followed by a woman shouting out, "Kneel, kneel," and then another bang. Linda Calvi, in her defence, tried to say, "I was called in for my son," because her son just happens to be called Neil, but the jury didn't believe her.
Additionally, it transpired that her son Neil hadn't even been home at the time, so really her fate was sealed.
When at a trial, they blamed each other for it. So basically a cutthroat defence, blaming each other. And then Danny Reese retracted what he said to take the blame off of her and take it on himself. When, again, we don't think he actually made the fatal shot.
One of the more interesting aspects of the evidence that came out of the trial was that the assailant, presumably, was seen. Somebody was certainly seen by witnesses, sort of skulking about in a green area to the front of the property and sort of hiding. And you'd think that if it all went off the way that the prosecution evidence was and the way the jury accepted it, there would be no reason for Daniel Reese to have to hide and skulk about outside the property. He would get access to the property. Linda could have let him in. He'd be there waiting in the flat, and could carry out the murder that way. It does make you wonder why that happened, you know, why they chose that as a way. Unless it was a very clever sort of double bluff to try to prove, you know, that the story was always going to be, yes, I was here, and somebody came in. So to have him outside and being seen by somebody else potentially is kind of a help to that story and to that make that more convincing. But it is a rather strange aspect of it.
He basically said that he'd gone in there, he'd been recruited to do it, and she pulled the trigger. That's what he told on the unsigned interview. I mean, the trial, yeah, they pretty much laid it on to each other, you know. But of course, you know, we were able to show at the trial that this guy that just happened to burst in and shoot her lover, she'd met him before. Obviously, she had told us that, but obviously we had a connection with her through Brian Thorogood and so on and so forth, and I think some of the family told us that he'd met her before and all that sort of stuff, so there's a coincidence, isn't there? The man you're not expecting, you happen to know.
At the trial, Linda professes her innocence. However, the jury they're not won over by this at all. They've heard compelling evidence, and she's jailed for 18.5 years.
The postscript to this is that 5 years after being jailed for life, along with Reese, the pair of them married in Parkhurst prison. So, I mean, quite what that was all about, who knows, but it was the second time she'd been married in prison.
She said that she loved Ronnie, she hadn't murdered him, she wasn't involved. Danny Reese had done it all, but she went on and married him.
Which, I suppose, yeah, may not be everybody's idea of romance, but it's somehow fitting for a woman like Linda Calvi.
For somebody to marry the killer of her lover, she says, let's not forget, I'm innocent, I'm in prison, I'm wrongly convicted, I didn't do it. And yet, he who did do it and killed my lover, I'm going to marry him. It's you know, a really unusual set of circumstances.
She was in an all-women's prison, as you would expect, but she was with hardened criminals. The kind of respect that she in the prison was phenomenal. We're talking really, it takes a lot for women to be jailed for life, the most heinous crimes. And she was actually in prison with Myra Hindley and went up to Myra and punched her in the face, which I think just gives an insight into the kind of person that Linda was. She was there to stamp her authority. She was going to be top dog in prison as she was outside prison, and she wasn't going to take any nonsense from anybody.
It's interesting, this title, The Black Widow, which apparently was coined by Joe Locke, who was one of the police officers investigating the Ronnie Cook murder. It's something at first that Linda didn't like, but she's sort of adopted it. And she's adopted it. She doesn't mind being called the Black Widow.
We were in an office meeting, and I think I just said, she's like a Black Widow spider. Like, because everyone she's ever had any dealings with is dead or in prison. And it stuck with that. And then the press latched onto that. It seemed to have stuck forever, that one.
Women who kill are still quite... they make programmes about them, don't they, and stuff like that. And, yeah, you'll get crimes of passion and one thing or another, but a woman who goes out and organises and then ultimately helps carry out a contract, shooting is quite rare.
One of the interesting things about Linda Calvi is that she claims to have been the inspiration for an ITV series called Widows, which was a very successful television programme back in the day, and it was based on a group of women whose husbands were armed robbers and all gone to prison, and they decided to carry on where their husbands had left off.
The difficulties in this investigation were, just given when it was, the reliance upon traditional methods, and one of the big things was blood pattern analysis, blood spatter analysis, and what that did was it tended to support the idea that Ronnie Cook was kneeling when he was shot, that he was shot from above by somebody aiming down at his head, and so tended to support the police/prosecution version of things more than the Linda Calvi version of things. Other difficulties are finding witnesses, not eyewitnesses, not neighbours or people who heard things or saw a man, but getting the background on how these people lived their lives. Because, as I say so many times, you have to know how they lived before you can tell how they died. And because you're looking then at a criminal underworld kind of culture, you have to be very careful in believing what is said to you. You have to check everything, stand everything up. But also just getting through the door to speak to people can be difficult in these cases. And so it needs a great deal of patience and a great deal of sort of sensitivity on the part of the investigators.